Hong Kong, 1970. The city never really slept. Neon signs buzzed over Nathan Road until 3 in the morning. Ferries groaned across the harbor, and in the cramped gyms tucked behind noodle shops and tailor stores, men trained the way monks pray. Quietly, relentlessly, and without an audience. Bruce Lee was already a name whispered in 2 languages. To the Chinese community, he was the boy who had grown up too fast in the alleys of Kowloon, the cha-cha champion turned street fighter turned philosopher of motion. To the Americans who had seen him on the Green Hornet, he was Kato, fast, silent, and dangerous in a way that made television executives nervous. But to the handful of men who trained with him in private, in a converted garage on a quiet side street, he was something else entirely. A man who had taken apart the very idea of style and rebuilt it from nothing. It was in that garage, on a humid Tuesday evening, that the rumor first arrived, carried, of all people, by a sports journalist named Desmond Fung, who wrote for a small English-language paper and had a habit of drinking in the same bars where sailors and boxing promoters swapped stories. "There's a Russian in town," Desmond said, leaning against the doorframe while Bruce wrapped his hands. "Name's Yevgeny Sokolov, heavyweight boxer, out of Leningrad. Fought exhibition bouts across Europe. Word is he's undefeated in 41 fights, 38 by knockout." Bruce didn't look up. Boxers come through Hong Kong all the time. Not like this one. He's here with a Soviet trade delegation, cultural exchange, officially. Unofficially, he's been going around the local dojos, calling Chinese martial arts decoration. Says it's dancing dressed up as fighting. Says no man who does not know how to be hit properly can call himself a fighter. That got Bruce's attention, not because of ego. Those who trained with him knew that wasn't really his weakness, but because of principle. Bruce Lee had spent years arguing, sometimes literally on paper, sometimes in exhibition halls in front of skeptical crowds, that the classical distinctions between styles were themselves the problem. He didn't care about defending Kung Fu's honor. He cared about defending truth, the idea that efficiency, not tradition, was what mattered when 2 bodies collided. "Where is he staying?" Bruce asked. Desmond grinned. He'd been hoping for that question. "The Peninsula. And he's got a standing challenge. Anyone who lasts more than a minute in the ring with him gets $500. Nobody's lasted 40 seconds yet. To understand what happened next, you have to understand who, or what, Yevgeny Sokolov actually was. He stood a shade over 6'3", built less like a boxer and more like a dock worker who happened to box, thick through the shoulders, with forearms that looked like they'd been carved rather than grown. He'd come up in the amateur circuits of the Soviet Union in the 1950s, in gyms where equipment was scarce and discipline was the only currency that mattered. Soviet sports authorities didn't send fighters abroad lightly. Every international bout was, in some small way, a proxy war fought with fists instead of missiles. Sokolov had been groomed for exactly this, to be a walking argument for Soviet physical superiority. He hit like a demolition crew. His jab alone had ended 2 European title fights in the first round. But what made him genuinely dangerous wasn't just power, it was patience. Sokolov didn't chase. He waited, absorbed a few shots to read his opponent's rhythm, and then, once he understood the pattern, he closed the distance and ended things in a single exchange. He had, by his own account, never lost a real fight, amateur, professional, or otherwise. And in interviews given to Soviet sports papers, translated years later by researchers curious about the legend, he was blunt in a way that Western boxers rarely were. "Kung Fu, karate, these are performances," he reportedly said, "meant for audiences who have never been hit. A man is not dangerous because he can kick a target held at his own trainer's convenience. He is dangerous when someone tries to kill him and he does not die. I have been in that position. Show me a Kung Fu man who has." It was the kind of quote that traveled, and it was the kind of quote that, when it reached a garage in Kowloon, made a very particular martial artist go quiet for a long moment before speaking again. Bruce didn't send a challenge through Desmond. That wasn't his style. Theatrics for the press rarely interested him nearly as much as people assumed. Instead, he simply showed up. The Peninsula Hotel's function room had been converted, temporarily, into something resembling a gym. Heavy bags hung from portable rigs, a rope-less practice ring marked with tape on the floor, and a small crowd of trade delegates, journalists, and curious hotel guests who'd heard whispers that the Russian Bear was holding open sessions in the evenings. Sokolov was midway through hitting a heavy bag when Bruce entered. He was wearing a plain white t-shirt and black trousers, no GI, no formal training uniform, nothing that announced him as a martial artist. He simply walked to the edge of the taped square and waited. It was Desmond, trailing a step behind, who made the introduction, mostly because someone had to, and Bruce clearly wasn't going to bother with small talk. Yevgeny Sokolov, this is Bruce Lee, local martial arts instructor, actor. He'd like to talk to you about your open challenge. Sokolov turned, wiped sweat from his brow with a towel, and looked Bruce over the way a butcher might size up a side of meat he wasn't sure was worth the cost. Bruce was, by any conventional boxing measure, small, 5'7", maybe 135 pounds when he'd eaten a full meal. Sokolov outweighed him by nearly 90 pounds. You want to try for the $500? Sokolov asked in accented but clear English. There was no malice in his voice. If anything, there was something almost gentle about it. The tone of a man who had said this so many times it had become routine. I will tell you the same thing I tell everyone. 1 minute. That is all I ask you survive. Nobody has done it. Not the karate men, not the wrestlers, not the street fighters who come and thinking their pride will carry them. I'm not interested in the money, Bruce said quietly. Then why are you here? Because you said something about Kung Fu being decoration. I'd like to understand what you meant. A ripple of amusement went through the small crowd. Sokolov actually smiled, the first genuine smile anyone in the room had seen from him all week. I meant exactly what I said. Come, let us understand each other properly. Gloves, if you like, or bare hands, if you are confident. I do not care. Either way, 1 minute. Try. What happened in the 90 seconds before the fight began is, according to the version of this story passed down over the decades, the part people remember most vividly, not because of any strike thrown, but because of what was said. Sokolov, lacing his gloves, glanced at Bruce's stance, a loose, coiled, almost cat-like posture, weight distributed unevenly, hands held lower and looser than any boxer would ever hold them. Your guard is wrong, Sokolov said, not unkindly. You will be hit before you know I have moved. I know, Bruce said. Sokolov paused. You know your guard is wrong, and you keep it anyway? My guard isn't meant to block your punch. It's meant to not be there when your punch arrives. Sokolov studied him for a moment longer, and something in his expression shifted. Not fear, nothing so dramatic, but the flicker of recognition that a serious man gives another serious man. He had heard confidence before. He had heard bravado from amateurs who thought size didn't matter, and quiet menace from professionals who thought technique alone would save them. This was neither. This was something closer to a mathematician stating a proof. We will see, Sokolov said, and stepped to his corner of the taped square. The room went quiet the way rooms do right before something important happens, not silent exactly, but hushed, the ambient noise of a hotel evening suddenly feeling very far away. Someone, Desmond, in most retellings, called the start. Sokolov didn't rush. That had never been his style. He advanced with the unhurried confidence of a man who had ended fights early but never needed to. He threw a testing jab, not his hardest punch, just a probe, the kind of shot meant to gauge distance and reaction time. It never landed. Bruce wasn't there. He'd shifted, not backward, which is what everyone in the room expected, but at an angle, stepping just outside the line of the punch while staying close enough that the miss put Sokolov's own balance a fraction of a second out of alignment. It was such a small thing. Most people in the crowd, watching casually, might not have consciously registered it as anything more than a boxer's punch missing. But Bruce had registered everything. He'd registered the exact moment Sokolov's weight committed to the jab, the exact half second where the big man's structure was, for the briefest possible instant, not fully his own to control. That was the gap. That was the only gap there would ever be. What followed took less time to happen than it takes to read this sentence. A short, whipping strike, not a haymaker, nothing that relied on load or wind up, but a strike generated from the ground up, through the hips, through a body that had spent over a decade being trained to produce maximum force through minimum visible motion, landed just beneath Sokolov's sternum, in the soft, unguarded seam where his own forward momentum had, for a fraction of a second, left him exposed. The sound it made wasn't dramatic. There was no cinematic crack. Just a short, compressed exhale, the sound of a large man's diaphragm being emptied all at once, faster than his body knew how to process. Sokolov's legs, for the first time in his professional life, did not obey him. He didn't fall so much as fold. One knee first, then the other, his gloved hands going instinctively to his stomach as his body tried, and failed, to remember how to breathe. Desmond, watching his stopwatch, because of course he'd been watching his stopwatch, would later swear the entire exchange, from the missed jab to Sokolov hitting the floor, had taken 7 seconds. Nobody clapped. That's the detail that shows up in almost every version of this story. Not triumphant applause, not gasps, just a strange, suspended silence, the kind that follows an event too fast and too complete for the mind to immediately categorize. Bruce didn't celebrate either. He crouched beside Sokolov, one hand on the big man's shoulder, and waited, patiently, without a trace of theater, for the Russian's breathing to steady. "You're all right," Bruce said quietly. "The wind will come back in a moment. Breathe slow." Sokolov, still gasping, managed a single word between breaths. "Fast." "Not fast," Bruce said. "Early. There's a difference." It took nearly a full minute. The very minute Sokolov had asked Bruce to survive, for the Russian to get his breath fully back. When he finally did, he sat up, waved off the hotel staff who'd rushed over with water, and looked at Bruce with an expression that had nothing left of the earlier condescension in it. "I have been hit by heavyweights," Sokolov said slowly. "I have been hit by men twice your size. I did not fall like that from any of them." "They were hitting where you expected to be hit," Bruce said. "I hit you somewhere you'd already decided couldn't be reached in time. That's not a size question. That's a timing question." Sokolov was quiet for a long moment. Then, in front of the delegates, the journalists, the hotel staff, still standing frozen with their unused glasses of water, he did something nobody in the room expected. "I said Kung Fu was decoration," he said. "I was wrong to say it as a rule. I should have said, most of what I have seen is decoration. This, what you did, this was not decoration." The $500, in every version of this legend, went unclaimed. Bruce reportedly refused it, telling Sokolov to put it toward his boxer's back in Leningrad instead. Whether that detail is true or merely a flourish added by decades of retelling, it fits. Those close to Bruce Lee often described a man far more interested in proving an idea than in profiting from a bet. Desmond Fung's article, if it was ever actually published, and no verified copy has ever, surfaced in archives, supposedly ran under the headline, 7 seconds, the night a boxer learned what speed really means. Over the following decades, the story was retold, exaggerated, translated, re-exaggerated, turned into podcast fodder, YouTube video scripts, forum posts, and eventually the kind of viral internet legend that arrives with a dramatic thumbnail and a booming narrator's voice. A Russian boxer challenged Bruce Lee. 7 seconds later, he was in the hospital. The hospital detail, most historians of the legend agree, was almost certainly an embellishment added much later. Sokolov, in the story as told above, never needed medical attention beyond catching his breath. But legends have their own gravity. They tend to grow more dramatic with each retelling, the way a stone rolling downhill picks up moss. What the exaggerations obscure, though, is the actual philosophy that made the story compelling enough to survive 50 years of retelling in the first place, because underneath the clickbait headlines is a genuinely interesting idea, one that Bruce Lee spent his entire career trying to articulate. Bruce Lee's real martial philosophy, not the movie version, but the one found in his notebooks, his letters, his recorded interviews, was never about being faster or stronger than an opponent in some abstract sense. It was about economy, about removing everything unnecessary from a movement until only the essential force remained. He called it, eventually, Jeet Kune Do, the way of the intercepting fist. The core idea was deceptively simple. The fastest way to stop an attack isn't to block it after it arrives, but to strike during its formation, in the fraction of a second when an opponent has committed to a motion but has not yet completed it. It's a principle borrowed as much from fencing and boxing theory as from any traditional Chinese martial art. Bruce studied Western boxing extensively, along with fencing, wrestling, and street fighting, discarding anything he considered ceremonial and keeping only what he could prove worked under pressure. In the story of the 7-second knockdown, whether it happened exactly as described or happened in some smaller, less dramatic form that later ballooned into legend, or never happened at all and exists purely as folklore built around a real philosophy, that is the principle being illustrated. Sokolov was not beaten because Bruce Lee was secretly stronger than a professional heavyweight boxer. He was beaten, in the logic of the story, because for one crucial half-second, his own forward commitment created an opening that a smaller, faster fighter with impeccable timing could exploit. It's worth noting, in fairness to the historical record, there is no documented, verified account of Bruce Lee ever fighting a professional boxer named Yevgeny Sokolov in Hong Kong or anywhere else. No newspaper archives from 1970 Hong Kong record such a match. No Soviet boxing records list a Bear of Leningrad with a 41-fight winning streak touring Asia on a cultural exchange. The story, as compelling as it is, appears to be one of many legendary confrontation tales that sprang up around Bruce Lee both during and after his life. Some rooted in real sparring sessions with real people that were later exaggerated beyond recognition, others invented entirely for entertainment. What is well documented is that Bruce Lee did, throughout his career, occasionally spar informally with practitioners of other combat sports, and that those who trained with him, Dan Inosanto, Chuck Norris, and others, consistently described his speed and his ability to read an opponent's structural weaknesses as genuinely exceptional, even by the standards of world-class martial artists and boxers who trained alongside him. Chuck Norris himself, a world karate champion, described Bruce Lee's speed as unlike anything he had encountered before or since. So while the specific story of the Russian boxer may be legend rather than history, the underlying reputation it draws from, of a fighter whose speed and precision seemed to defy his size, was, by all credible accounts, very real. Stories like this one persist, not because audiences are gullible, but because they crystallize something people already believe, or want to believe, about the nature of skill versus size, precision versus power, preparation versus raw physical advantage. The David and Goliath shape of the tale, a smaller man, dismissed as unserious, defeating a larger man through superior technique, taps into something almost mythic, a pattern found across cultures and centuries, from biblical parables to martial arts, folklore across Japan, China, and beyond. Bruce Lee, more than almost any other martial artist of the 20th century, became a canvas onto which these kinds of stories were painted, because his real life already contained the raw material that made the myths believable. He genuinely was smaller than most opponents he faced. He genuinely did emphasize speed and precision over brute strength. He genuinely did challenge the martial arts establishment of his era, arguing publicly and repeatedly that rigid traditional styles were often less effective than they claimed to be, a position that made him plenty of real enemies within the traditional martial arts community of 1960s and 70s Hong Kong and America. So when a story surfaces, a Russian boxer, an open challenge, 7 seconds, a body hitting the floor, it finds fertile ground. It doesn't feel like fiction, even when it is. It feels like the kind of thing that should have happened, given everything else we know to be true about the man at its center. Perhaps that's the most honest way to close this story. Not with a definitive verdict on whether Yevgeny Sokolov ever set foot in a Hong Kong hotel ballroom, but with an acknowledgement of what these kinds of legends actually do. They aren't lies, exactly. Not in the way a legend teller usually intends them. They're a kind of folk tribute, a way of saying, this man's speed, his philosophy, his refusal to be underestimated because of his size, was so remarkable that we needed a story big enough to hold it. Bruce Lee died in 1973, at 32 years old, having redefined not just martial arts cinema, but the way an entire generation thought about combat, discipline, and the relationship between mind and body. He never, as far as any verified historical record shows, fought a Soviet heavyweight boxer in a Hong Kong hotel. But he did spend his short life proving, again and again, in dojos, on film sets, and in serious sparring sessions with genuinely world-class fighters, That speed executed with precision could overturn almost any assumption about what size and strength alone could guarantee.